What's going on, everyone? My name is Daniel Epler, and this is the YouTube channel where we celebrate all kinds of movies. And today we're going to be talking about my top 10 classic noir films. And when I'm talking about classic noir, I'm talking about that string of movies that came out in the black and white era, the 1940s and the 1950s in particular. And basically what these movies are is they are crime films. To put it the most simply, they could be about a private investigator who is investigating crime, could be about criminals who are pulling a heist or maybe on the run from the law. They could be about people having an illicit affair and planning to murder a spouse or something like that. Basically, they are movies that show the cynicisms of the World War II era, both during World War II and afterwards. And I really like these movies because they're coming out during the time of the Hays Code, right? During the time when movies are censored and they're only supposed to be about and display certain things. And these are the movies that are sneaking through that are telling you some realities about what were people afraid of at this time? What were the anxieties of this time? What were they feeling cynical about? So I find them to be very real feeling, but they're also great escapism because they're so much fun with the hard-boiled dialogue, the great movie stars, that great photography that's black and white in almost all cases, and just showing a lot of shadow and darkness. They tend to be really visually beautiful movies, and they tend to have a lot of good jazz music, and I tend to be a jazz fan, so I love these movies, and right now it is Noirvember, and over on my podcast, the Cobwebs podcast, I just put out an episode on a noir film, and I think I said on the episode at some point, I said, like, I should really sit down and figure out what my top 10 noir films are, it's because before today, I hadn't actually done that. So these are my personal 10 favorite noir films. This is not the generally accepted list. If you look up, like, what are the classic, the Turner Classic Movies experts say are the 10 greatest noir films of all time, it's going to look different from my list. It's going to be some crossover, but it's going to be different. So this is my personal list. I would love to see what your list is, though. If you've got a top 10 classic noir films, please drop them down below. And when I say classic noir, I do mean classic. We're not going to be talking about neo-noir today. No Blade Runner, no Chinatown, nothing like that. These are movies from, I believe all of mine are from the 40s and the 50s. All black and white films, my 10 favorites, so let's kick things off. A number 10 spot is always difficult because there's so many movies that could slide in there, any of those honorable mentions, but I'm gonna go with a recent discovery, one that I have found that I'm a big fan of, and that is I Walk Alone from 1947. This one is directed by Byron Haskin, and it's starring Burt Lancaster, Kirk Douglas, and Elizabeth Scott. Now, what it's about is Burt Lancaster is a convict who just got let out of prison after 10 years in prison, and we come to find out that him and Kirk Douglas were bootleggers during the Prohibition era. They got chased by cops when they're hauling some whiskey at one point. Kirk Douglas gets away, Burt Lancaster does not, and he takes the fall. So Kirk Douglas becomes this very successful man, a bit of a criminal, but like a socially acceptable criminal who's got accountants and lawyers on his side and such. And Burt Lancaster wants his piece of the pie, and maybe Kirk Douglas is not going to give it up so easily. What I love about this movie is Burt Lancaster is such a cannonball in this movie. He has got so much raw energy and passion, and he's just ready to bash up Kirk Douglas's life. Elizabeth Scott plays a love interest for Burt Lancaster. I find her to be kind of an unsung hero of noir. She's really great. And it's actually a really romantic noir film, which is something that I really enjoy. Their romance is the main thing that makes Burt Lancaster likable, because otherwise, he's not a good guy. And that's something that I like about noirs. You got a lot of anti-heroes, people who are like, I don't know if I can quite root for you morally, but I really like watching you. And this Kirk Douglas over here is a slime ball. There's actually another movie where Kirk Douglas plays second tier to another star in which he's kind of a bad guy. This ends up being the one that makes my personal list. Next up, one of the most classic films on here, and that is The Maltese Falcon from 1941. This one is directed by John Huston, an absolutely quintessential noir, because if you want to ask me what is the first thing I think of when I think a hard-boiled private detective in a black and white movie, I'm thinking of Humphrey Bogart as Detective Sam Spade. Bogart is phenomenal in this movie because, again, like what I was talking about with the last movie, he's a bit of an anti-hero. He is your PI, your main character who you're going through the movie with. He's not a good person, and I love the darkness that Humphrey Bogart puts off. He's got an amazing supporting cast all around him. It's actually a movie that I didn't love the first time I saw it, but I have come to really, really appreciate a lot of its beautiful photography and that really hard-boiled dialogue that Humphrey Bogart is giving off while he's trying to figure out the mystery of the quintessential MacGuffin of cinema, the Maltese Falcon. At number 8, we have got Gun Crazy from 1950, directed by Joseph H. Lewis. And this is one of your classic lovers on the run stories. It's starring Peggy Cummings and John Dahl. John Dahl is, they're both, as the movie suggests, gun crazy. He's this incredible marksman just recently released from the military. And there is a kind of traveling carnival going that he visits, and he meets Peggy Cummings, who is their sharpshooter attraction. He's the only one who's able to beat her in a sharpshooting competition. And there's this attraction that sparks between them. And pretty quickly they are married, and she starts talking him into a lot of criminal dealings. Let's use our gun skills to get rich, essentially. And they start robbing some places. There is an amazing heist sequence of them robbing this company's payroll, and they go on the run from there. It is a terrifying movie, I think. Like, when I want to think about like the scariest scenarios I can think of, just being sucked down this bad path when John Dahl is not a bad guy, really, but he's sucked down this bad path by a classic femme fatale. And suddenly he's this criminal, and he never meant to be a criminal, and he's not a bad person, but now he's forced into this situation where the cops are going to get him at any second. He might even have to shoot people just to be able to survive. And it's a really, really scary movie. Does not lead to a happy place. That's another thing with noir. Not a lot of happy endings. Coming in at number 7 is a movie that, despite the fact that it has one of the most iconic shots in all of cinema, I consider it to overall be an underrated noir, and that is Gilda from 1947, directed by Charles Vidor. This movie is starring Rita Hayworth and Glenn Ford. Yes, this is the movie where you see Rita Hayworth flip her red hair back and ask me. You've probably seen it in, I think it's in The Shawshank Redemption, actually, or if you search this movie on any GIF website. But anyway, this movie is starring Glenn Ford as a gambler who starts working for this super rich guy at a casino, and he meets the rich guy's boss, who is Gilda, played by Rita Hayworth, realizes she's actually an old flame of his, and they now hate each other. But it's a really great noir. What makes it so fun is that Rita Hayworth and Glenn Ford's dialogue is so hateful and biting between the two, because they hate each other, but there's still that attraction. So it ends up being a movie with a ton of sexual tension, and maybe they start coming back together. Maybe they want to overthrow the rich guy and be together, but also get rich, but also Gilda is a classic femme fatale, so what are her motives? It's a really fun movie with a lot of twists and turns. Glenn Ford is one of my favorite movie stars of all time, actually. He hasn't quite stood the test of time in the public consciousness, like Jimmy Stewart or Cary Grant or someone like that, but I find him to be one of the grumpiest movie stars of all time, and this movie is, in a good way, and this movie is a great example of that. Number 6 is a massive classic, surely one, if you haven't seen it, you've heard of it. That is Stanley Kubrick's The Killing. The Killing is from 1956. It is starring Sterling Hayden, one of my favorite people to star in a noir. And this movie is all about a heist. It is deep in the weeds of being about a heist. Guys who are planning one of robbing a racetrack. The movie is about planning the heist and then executing it. And what do you do even if you succeed? It is a masterclass in tension. Stanley Kubrick is, of course, known as one of the greatest directors of all time. This is one of my favorite movies from him, one of that is so effective in what it is setting out to do. And it has one of the greatest endings of all time. So what can I say? The Killing is amazing. You should totally watch it. And actually, I have an episode of my podcast dedicated to this movie, so you can check that out. I'll put the link down below. Number 5 is another fairly recent discovery for me, and that is In a Lonely Place from 1950. It's directed by Nicholas Ray, one of my favorite directors for noir, as you will see a little bit later on this list. And this is another bogey movie. It's starring Humphrey Bogart and Gloria Graham. Humphrey Bogart is an author who is not, he's our protagonist. We like him. He's not unlikable, but he has a really bad temper if he gets angry. And we come to find out that a young girl who was recently in Humphrey Bogart's company turns out to be murdered, and Humphrey Bogart is a suspect. Did he do it? Did we not? We as the audience don't know. Gloria Graham doesn't either, who is his neighbor who starts a romance with him. And we watch their romance blossom, him become a better person while being with her. And all the while, we don't know if he killed this girl. The cops don't know if he did it. Gloria Graham doesn't know if he did it. And so much of this movie is about her loving him, but her tension of not knowing that. And it raises to such dramatic heights. It is such an intense movie by the end. One of my favorite noirs by far. That's In a Lonely Place. Number 4 is The Big Heat from 1953, directed by Fritz Lang. Fritz Lang is an iconic director who directed M with Peter Lorre, one of the most classic serial killer movies ever made. And The Big Heat it's so much fun. This is another movie starring Glenn Ford. He is a tough cop who is taking on this whole criminal syndicate, but he's also a family man. And what happens if these criminals also come after him? Glenn Ford this is probably my favorite Glenn Ford performance. He's so intense in this movie. And this is just kind of your classic cops versus criminals movie with amazing dialogue scenes. It also has Gloria Graham. It has Lee Marvin. Gloria Graham is Lee Marvin's girlfriend. Lee Marvin is a criminal, and she undergoes a terrible tragedy at the hand of these criminals that she hangs out with, goes to try to help Glenn Ford. It's such a fun movie. I love The Big Heat. Also did a podcast on this movie, link down below. At number 3, the most recent discovery for me on this list, and it is already shot up to number 3. It is The Sweet Smell of Success. It's from 1957, directed by Alexander McKendrick, and this is another Burt Lancaster movie. Burt Lancaster and Tony Curtis. And it's an unusual plot for a noir. We're not so much dealing with cops and criminals here. We're dealing with a very corrupt power, media, political system in New York in the 1950s. Burt Lancaster is a gossip columnist who at this time in history, a person who just writes a column in a newspaper could be enormously powerful, and he is. And Tony Curtis is a publicist, and Tony Curtis is basically this movie describes him as a dog to Burt Lancaster, and that Lancaster has total control of him because he has total control over his finances. Tony Curtis relies on him to put his clients into his column. It's a publicity exchange. And all the while, Burt Lancaster's sister is trying to marry this guy, and Burt Lancaster wants to ruin that relationship and is using Tony Curtis to do it. It's got some of the greatest performances I've ever seen in a noir film, with Tony Curtis especially, but also Lancaster. Some of the most biting dialogue, just so many incredible iconic lines all throughout this film. The Sweet Smell of Success is one of the best movies out there, I think, and it's my third favorite noir film of all time. At number 2 is the first noir film I can remember having a big impact on me, and it was my number 1 for a very long time until last year, actually. My number 2 is Double Indemnity from Billy Wilder. This movie is from 1944, probably the most iconic noir film. It's starring Fred MacMurray and Barbara Stanwyck, and this is one of those illicit affair movies where they're having an affair. She has a very rich husband, and she floats out the idea, what if we murder him and take all his money? And the movie is their descent into figuring out how can they go through with this? How can they get away with it? Eventually it goes through that process. And then it's how do we get away with it? And that is something that noir gets into quite a bit, is the idea of even if you can be a criminal, can you get away with it? Or will the guilt and the tension of looking over your shoulder, will it ruin your life? That's much what this movie is about, but it's one of the most fun movies like ever because the dialogue is so much fun. It's probably the most sexual of the classic noirs when it comes to the innuendo thrown back and forth between MacMurray and Stanwyck. One of Barbara Stanwyck's best performances, absolutely. And Fred MacMurray is so cool in this movie, but gotta give some major props to Edward G. Robinson as an insurance investigator who knows there's just something not right with this death. It's gotta be murder, and he's gotta figure out what's going on. So Double Indemnity is one of my favorite movies. It's my second favorite film noir. But at number 1, it is the noir I'm the most emotional about, and it's the only noir film to ever make me cry, and it's They Live by Night. It's from 1948, directed by Nicholas Ray, who also directed In a Lonely Place. And this movie is starring Farley Granger as a man who is on the run from a prison escape with a bunch of other criminals, but he's with a bunch of hardened criminals because they're the ones who helped him to escape. But he's not really that guy. We never really find out why he was in prison, but we get the idea that he was just a good guy who made a mistake, wrong place, wrong time sort of situation. And he starts to fall for the daughter of one of these criminals in his house where they're holding up, who's played by Kathy O'Donnell. And she is a little bit odd, very socially awkward, but he is too. And it's really a movie about two kind of strange, flawed people finding each other and running away together. And the whole world is constantly crashing down on them and ruining their life at every turn. So they just want to be happy together. They want to have a normal life. They want that 1950s picket fence fantasy that everyone was going after in the 50s, and that TV shows especially were really pushing in that decade. They want all of that, but they can't have it because he made this one mistake and he escaped from prison. And at any point, the cops are going to find them. And the police force feel like this overwhelming, powerful horror force in this movie that's actually pretty scary. So it's a very intense movie. It's a very romantic movie for when their romance and their relationship is going well. But when things fall apart, things get very antagonistic and there's a lot of tension. So it's very much a very real feeling relationship under these kind of circumstances. So They Live by Night, it's my number one noir film of all time. The most emotional a noir has ever made me. And if you haven't seen it, because it's not quite as classic as like the Maltese Falcon or something like that, I definitely recommend checking it out. It's my number one. So that's my top 10 film noir movies. I would really love to see what your list is. Leave it in the comment down below. Leave a like and a subscribe as well, because we got more videos coming on the way. And I'll see you next time, guys.